Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. As nonprofit leadership is increasingly under the microscope when it comes to public trust, transparency, and accountability, particularly in light of recent high-profile revelations about organizations such as Hockey Canada and We Charity, and as the sector grapples with a lack of diversity at a leadership level, we ask, is it time for a leadership refresh? Joining me to discuss these important issues is Bruce MacLellan, CEO of Proof Strategies. Since 2016, Bruce has led the CanTrust Index, an annual study of trust in Canada. The study's results are shared publicly to advance knowledge and understanding on how to maintain and grow trust. Welcome, Bruce.
Hi, Mary. It's nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about trust.
Well, I'm very excited to speak to you because I understand you have a hot off the press report that just came out for 2023. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about the CanTrust Index and what the goal of this report is, and what kind of insights does it give us into Canadian society as a whole?
Great. I'd be pleased to. We started studying trust in Canada 8 years ago with our CanTrust Index, and our goal was to simply contribute to the conversation about trust and where it's going in Canada, and to remind people of how important it is to success. It's fundamental to our success as a democracy. People need to trust that our elections work and are fair and representative. It's critical to success of the economy. Economists will tell you that a society or an economy with higher trust is actually more efficient because transactions can happen quicker and with less scrutiny, less review. There's all kinds of benefits from trust in a society. And, everybody would sort of nod their head and agree to that. But the challenge is it's a bit of a situation where the understanding of trust is a mile wide and only an inch deep. So what we're trying to do with our study and some of the related work is to promote the importance of trust, understanding more about how trust works, and how every organization should have a plan for what's their roadmap for building trust.
Well, as I've mentioned, you do have a report that was just published. You've just released data from the 2023 report. In general, what does it show us? Where are things improving and where are there still cracks?
Right. So it's been a very interesting time over the last 3 years to be studying trust because of the pandemic. And we saw the pandemic have a really massive and sudden impact on trust in Canada. In some cases, it caused increases, and in other cases, it caused decreases. During the pandemic, for example, Canadians placed a huge amount of trust in medical doctors and scientists. As soon as COVID-19 was heard about, and as soon as the World Health Organization declared the pandemic, there was a jump in trust in those two professions because Canadians believe in facts, they believe in expertise, and they wanted to hear from the experts on what they needed to know and do about COVID-19. There was also trust in our medical health officers in the provinces and in Ottawa. Then what we saw during the 2 years of pandemic was fatigue. And, we can all relate to this, the restrictions, the limitations, the emotional highs and lows of vaccines, and then more vaccines, and then new forms of the virus. So by January of 2022, we do our annual survey every January. We were just starting to be thinking we were coming out of the pandemic when Omicron hit. So January of 2022 was really the low point of trust in many ways. And we saw a steady decline in trust in government during the pandemic and a real low in that January. The interesting news in our study that we just released yesterday, this new 2023 study of the CanTrust Index, is there was a spike in trust in government. So there's been a bounce back in trust in government. As I know we're not exactly returning to normal, but we're in a much better position compared to a year ago. So now Canadians who've always had a pretty high trust in government are starting to return to that trust. And, of course, the agenda is changing with, other issues dominating the public discussion, such as inflation, the possibility of recession, climate change and its impact. There's a lot of other issues that are now influencing trust in Canada.
Your 2022 report showed a really interesting correlation between anxiety levels and trust. Can you elaborate on what that correlation is, and were you able to continue measuring it in the 2023 report?
Yes, so we know that the individual's level of satisfaction influences how much they trust. So that would include economic satisfaction or emotional satisfaction or other aspects of what they look at and what do they want in their life. So we know at the point of Omicron last January, there was a lot of tension. Some people were saying the government's been too restrictive. We got to get rid of these restrictions. Other people were saying, I'm frightened. I want these rules in place. And other people were on the fence. So we asked a question in our survey to see which camp of those three options were people in. And the people who expressed continuing anxiety after 2 years had lower trust in almost every question that we asked. And, it's somewhat natural to expect that these people were worried. They weren't sure if they were going to be safe. Most of them had been vaccinated, but they still didn't know if it was okay to go out. They'd just come off a holiday season where they were being cautioned about seeing their family and friends. So that anxiety was translating into a lack of trust. Why can't I see my family if I've been vaccinated? It was deeply frustrating and hard for Canadians. So that contributed to lower trust. Now, interestingly, a year later, Mary, what we're seeing is an emerging economic anxiety, and particularly with the younger generations where housing affordability is a big concern. So our new 2023 study has pointed to the potential emergence of a generation gap in trust in Canada, where older Canadians, say, boomers and up, have high and rising levels of trust, whereas millennials and Gen Z are showing flat or diminishing levels of trust, and it's particularly correlated to their growing level of economic anxiety.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. We're doing a podcast for the nonprofit sector, and so I just want to return back to public trust in the nonprofit sector. Over the past decade, there's been multiple reports, including the CanTrust Index, that have indicated a worrying drop in public trust in nonprofits and charities. And in 2022, your report indicated public trust in these organizations stabilized at 47%, halting that startling decline that we saw earlier. Where's that number sitting now with the new data? Are there any significant differences in this data versus the special report on the trust levels of Black Canadians that was done?
Right. Well, there's a couple of points out of that question that I could address. So, in some good news for the not-for-profit sector, our 2023 study shows that there's been an uptick in trust in NGOs and charities. So it's climbed to 50%. It was down to 46% last year. So in 3 consecutive years, from 2021 and 22, we'd seen slow but continuing decline in trust in the charitable sector. I would say that correlated with the We Charity scandal. The timing was, identical. So, and the We situation was very high profile. So I think it's easy to make that link. And, to some degree, it shows you resilience of the charitable sector, that it didn't fall further as that was happening. So Canadians were, separating in their minds that what was going on with the We Charity didn't necessarily mean that was happening with all charities. This year, we've seen a jump up in trust in charities. And I think that could be because, again, we've moved out of this sort of pandemic low. People are feeling generally a little more uplifted. We still have some issues and there's new economic concerns, but in general, we're feeling better than we did a year ago. So that's contributing to a slight increase in trust in the charitable sector. And the other thing is that, we've seen some prominent charities playing important roles in our world as natural disasters or other situations happen. The Red Cross was, instrumental in helping people in Atlantic Canada after the hurricane, in British Columbia after the flooding. So when you have a sort of a brand name marquee charity like the Canadian Red Cross getting out there and showing Canadians its good work, that will kind of fuel the rise in trust. And then, there's other charities as well, international organizations that are helping in the war in Ukraine or in famine in Africa. All of that will fuel trust. And, there's very few operations or organizations where trust is more important than a charity, because you're asking people to give you their money. They need to trust that that money is going to be well taken care of, well used, used for important causes and not wasted on administration. Massive importance to trust in operating a charity.
No question at all. Now, on the heels of the We Charity scandal, we've seen the scandal that emerged from Hockey Canada, which I mentioned earlier. Do you anticipate that could impact this trust level that we've seen rise as time and distance takes us away from some of the more high-profile reporting around the We Charity to again be bringing attention and concern around trust for nonprofits in general?
Well, it's interesting. At the moment, the data suggests that connection is not happening, which is good for the not-for-profit sector. And it could be that Hockey Canada is not instantly seen as a charity. It's seen as a governing body. It's seen as an administrative organization. It's not necessarily seen as a charity the way you would think of, the Cancer Society or the Red Cross or UNICEF or the Nature Conservancy. Those are instantly known as charities, whereas Hockey Canada has sort of a blurred image. And indeed, during this past year where the Hockey Canada scandal was playing out, we find, this slight increase in trust again in charities. So there's a separation going on there. We did ask about trust in Hockey Canada specifically in our 2023 survey, and it stands at 30%, pretty low, contrasted to the charitable sector at 50%.
That's interesting. So the Canadian public is making the distinction about, one organization does not reflect the entire sector. And so that's good for nonprofits generally and the sector at large.
Exactly, it is. Now, a minute ago, you asked about our study last year of Black Canadians. So I'd like to just return to that and say that we did a separate survey with a Black-owned research company to look specifically at trust within the Black Canadian community and identify insights and differences that there might be with that segment of our population. And indeed, we did find some differences. Notable is that that community's trust in government and not-for-profit is higher than the average for Canada, and their trust in the corporate private sector is lower than the average for overall in Canada. So we see that as potentially being a reflection of the fact that they've had more interaction with government, they've had more interaction with not-for-profit charities, which has been positive, or they see a lot of Canadians will tell you that that the government in Canada has an important role in intervening to make Canada better for its citizens. So it could be that community is seeing the important role of government as an advocate for citizens, and perhaps even to protect citizens against, other parts of our society. So, it was notable that we see higher levels of trust in many areas. On the other hand, and, we probably wouldn't be surprised by this, we saw lower levels of trust among Black Canadians in some institutions like the police, where there've been, a lot of tensions and concerns and, evidence of systemic racism. So the trust in an institution like the RCMP or the trust in just local police forces is lower in the Black Canadian community. The most trusted source of information for Black Canadians is friends and family. They are very trusting of their own community, and then beyond that, the second most trusted source would be family doctors.
Interesting. So, have you ever done any sort of survey or report on the trust levels of Indigenous communities?
That's on our list. Good question, Mary. We're looking into that. Part of the challenge is collecting the sample in some very remote settings. So we've been talking to some research companies about the methodology of how to do such a survey and to get accurate results. It's also very important when you do surveys like that to make sure that you are not stepping into any unintended cultural errors. I mentioned a minute ago how when we did the survey of Black Canadians, we used a Black-owned research company. Specific surveys of specific cultural groups require a lot of delicate planning and careful execution. And we are looking into that. Each year we do a main study of the overall country and the population, and then we look at a specific secondary group or aspect of trust. Last year I mentioned it was the study of Black Canadians. This year, in 2023, we've done a deeper dive on trust in government and democracy. So it's a topic-specific deep dive around how Canadians are feeling around government and democracy. And we're releasing a separate report on that later in February to share with Canadians. And, we make all of this research publicly available. We dump all the data on our website and everybody can look at it. And as I said, our goal is simply to promote a conversation about trust and help Canadians be more aware of how it works and what they can do.
Well, I certainly hope that you'll come back and speak to us about some of those other reports that you have in the works. I'd like to go back to the nonprofit sector and talk about what leadership should be paying attention to in terms of the trends that they see in public trust. What implications are possible if Canadians continue to have issues around distrust in the sector? Because although it's increased slightly, I guess, to 50%, it's still 50%. I mean, it's saying that the majority of Canadians do not have trust in the nonprofit sector. So what must they be doing? What should leaders be paying attention to?
Right. Okay. So first of all, I'll just, for the listeners, comment on our methodology of our research. So when we ask Canadians about their trust in an organization or a sector or an individual, we use a 7-point scale in their response, a 1 to 7, with 7 being the highest trust and 1 being, no trust. To come up with the percentage, say 50%, that 50% is the people who chose 5, 6, or 7 on the scale. So there's a middle ground of all the people who choose 4, and that will vary according to each question and topic and what we're asking. It's really the people who choose 1, 2, or 3 who are saying they do not trust. So our sometimes we've been told our scale is really tough, and we're like a teacher that marks hard on the essay or the exam. We think a 7-point scale gives Canadians a range of options that allows us to really zero in on who they do trust and who they don't. But there's always going to be, and for the charitable sector, I'm sure, a good chunk of Canadians who are at that 4. And those are the people who we could move. So if I was the CEO of an organization, I am a CEO of an organization actually in my company, but if I was the CEO of a charitable organization, I would want to do some research and look at the audiences that are important to me, my donors, my employees, perhaps my partners in executing programs or delivering services, maybe the clientele user group that we provide support to. And I'd want to do some research to understand how they feel about us and what are their trust levels. And what that would tell me is if I did a survey of my employees, for example, and asked them a 7-point scale about trust, first of all, I'd find out how many are in that 5, 6, 7 trusting group. But then I could also find out how many are in the 4, that undecided neutral middle ground. And then I could start to roll out some programs to figure out how to connect better with those people. Why are they feeling a 4? Is it because they want more frequent town halls to understand what's going on in the organization? Do they want a monthly newsletter so they understand better? Do they want to have a Q&A session with the CEO twice a year where they can ask their questions and hear answers? There's all sorts of ways that you can build trust, but you first have to diagnose it. And given that there's studies like ours out there that you can compare to, you can take our study as a benchmark, then you can conduct the parallel study in your own organization, and on an audience by audience basis, assess the trust level currently, and then understand what they would want to do differently. We ask Canadians what are the drivers of trust for them in organizations or brands, and we know that one of the top areas identified is a sense of shared values. People want to understand what are the values of your organization and how do your decisions flow from those values so that they make sense and that they can agree with them. And of course, they hope that they're shared values. We also know that Canadians like organizations where the leadership is open and communicates and transparent. So that's why I was giving those examples a minute ago about CEOs communicating more often. We know that Canadians like organizations that have practices that treat their employees well and promote worker health and safety. So, for you working in the area that you work in and your clients, employee health and safety is one of the top drivers of trust. And that's not just for employees in their own organization, but for consumers evaluating organizations they might make purchases from. So you can research trust, you can identify where your strengths or weaknesses are and where you need to improve, and then you can have a game plan to improve it. And what we see is that a lot of lip service where people say, oh yeah, trust is important. And, I see banks, they talk about trust, but then I see them treating people poorly and not behaving like they really want to build trust.
Right. Do you see, well, you're getting to the consequences of not being able to inspire trust. What are some of the consequences for leaders of nonprofits who are, I guess, not paying attention to this particular aspect of how they connect with the community? You did touch on this a little earlier, that is there ever been a measurement of a correlation to potentially, donations, for example?
Well, economists have done studies that correlate trust with sales, trust with employee innovation, trust with employee recruitment. So what I've seen in limited academic studies around trust with charities and not-for-profits is, your audience may not want to hear this, but what happens is, because it's a not-for-profit, the audiences tend to assign a higher level of expectation. So, if you're a not-for-profit charity, we expect you to be even better, even more ethical, even more careful, even more, responsible in your behavior and your choices. So there was one academic study done that looked at when scandals occurred in private corporations compared to not-for-profit organizations. And the damage of the scandal was greater in the charitable organization compared to the private sector organization. And their analysis was it's because of the higher expectation. If you were a charity, you've got to be better. You've got to behave better. Corporations, they should behave better too, but the expectations are lower. So, again, this is where leaders and boards of directors have a role here too, to understand trust and how important it is to their organization, and understand that they're in the not-for-profit sector, they're operating at an even higher level of expectation.
Right. There's also an aspect of, I guess you mentioned this, but employee trust is something that you've also measured. And I think there's a lot more transparency that's caused by technology and some platforms, Glassdoor, for example, that actually rates what it's like to be an employee within an organization. So this has become much more public than it had in the past. And the 2022 report indicated that in general, employee trust in employers had risen from a D grade, which is frankly pretty bad, in January 2021 to a C grade, which isn't terrific, in 2022. Has anything else changed in 2023? I'm curious about how employees are feeling with regards to their trust levels in their employer.
Right. Well, it's a great question. And our philosophy is that trust is built from the inside out. So if an organization wants to have a plan of action to build trust, they must start with their employees, because it's their employees, after all, who will be the ambassadors for the organization and who know best what is actually going on. So if you're out there telling people why they should trust you and the employee is sitting there thinking, that's not true, or no, that's not what goes on here, it's going to blow up on you. Like we've seen many cases where when corporations or other organizations try to put out external messaging that their employees know is not valid or true, it catches up with them. Facebook, has lived through this several times where they say they're doing things to, prevent misinformation or prevent, hostility or racism on Facebook. But then their employees say, no, they're not trying that hard. And it catches up with them. So you have to walk the talk internally in your organization about having values, standing for those values, and then living up to those values in how you treat your employees and how you work and how you communicate. So one of our questions annually in our survey is when we survey all of Canadians, of course, not all of them are in the workforce. So we ask only the ones who are in the workforce, if they had to give a letter grade to their employer for how good their employer is at building trust, what would that letter grade be? And as you've pointed out, Mary, it went from a D in 21 to a C in 22. And this year, again in 23, it's another C. So not very impressive. I mean, you don't even graduate from business school if you have a C average. And further, I'm going to really give you the bad news here. We subdivide the employees who are giving us this grade by their level in the organization, starting with frontline workers and then running through different levels up to C-suite or upper management. Every one of those groups gives a C. Even upper management is giving itself a C grade. And these are people who should know better and who have the power and responsibility to do better. I find it very distressing. I try to walk the talk, and my company, Proof Strategies, has been regularly appeared on the Great Place to Work Institute's list of top employers in Canada. Even way back in 2010, we were named the #1 workplace in Canada of all companies on their list. So this is something that I take very seriously, and my team, I would hope, know that I walk the talk and take steps to make clear what our values are, and then to implement decisions and policies that can be traced back to those values, and that take care of our employees and show respect for them as individuals and for their needs outside of the workplace, of course. This has become an even bigger issue. We hear a lot of talk about the importance of empathy. Empathy is a driver of trust in all relationships, but including your employees. So when the score went from a D to a C during the pandemic, I took that as a good sign that employers in Canada were taking seriously the threats and the challenges that people were facing in the pandemic. Much higher anxiety and stress for workers, emotional anxiety from the home and families, an increase in mental health issues and challenges, all kinds of unintended consequences that caused anxiety and stress and required employers to be more flexible. Parents who had, children of school age not able to go to school and having to, have your kids learning at home while you're also trying to do your job. Really difficult situations. So it was good news when the score went from D to C. However, it's not very impressive that now we seem to be stuck at a C. And when you look at all those different segments of employees, at every level from the frontline worker to the C-suite is giving that organization a C. And this is why we really promote more knowledge about trust and why it's an important area to have a plan for how are you going to build trust.
So it raises a good question. If you're a leader and that's what you were seeing in your organization, what can a leader do to change the balance, to make a positive contribution to evolve that and get a better passing grade?
Well, I think two-way communication and listening. Um, Start with your employees and understand what they want and need. Understand what they think about your organization and what they like and don't like or are concerned by or would like to understand better. Um, you know, Quarterly pulse surveys, some group meetings, large groups, smaller groups. Do a trust study. Our trust surveys on our website. You could literally take the questions and replicate it with your own employee group and see how the results compare. There's other forms of research that could be done. So understand what your employees need to know in terms of their drivers of trust. Understand if they understand, if there's alignment with values. I mean, in my company, we have over the years always talked about values, and as we were coming out of the pandemic, we did an employee consultation process where we engaged every single employee in a review of our values, and did we all agree that these are the values that will take us forward, that will continue to serve as a great place to work and a place that does great work for our clients. And we did. We settled on 6 values. And first of all, they're everywhere around the organization now, and you're constantly reminded of them. And we talk about what does it mean to bring these values to work? And how do you exhibit these values as an individual to your colleagues? It's not just about what the CEO does, it's what everyone does. Another piece of advice we give people is that trust is a team sport. Trust has been shown in academic research to be driven, sure, by the CEO, by senior leaders in the organization, but all people, managers, mid-level, lower-level managers play a huge role in the building of trust or the damaging of trust by how they act. So you need to kind of cultivate the foundation of values, the expected behavior of people to treat each other well, and then hold people accountable and start, hopefully, to see your trust scores improve. I know it happens. We've seen organizations that do it. It really just requires some discipline and some thoughtful work, and it can happen. But again, not everyone just devotes the time or takes it seriously enough.
Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation. Is there any final comments, particularly for our audience of nonprofit professionals, leaders, and frontline workers, that you'd like to leave related to advice or just some things to really bear in mind as they look towards the rest of 2023 and beyond?
Well, the academic research about trust has identified what we call it the ABI model. So it's ability, benevolence, and integrity. So those are the 3 top drivers of trust. And what I mean by that is, firstly, ability. What you claim to do, show people you're doing it really well. For a telecommunications company, it would mean you're giving really highly reliable phone service. The phone works well, the range of the coverage works well, the data service works well. Give people a high quality experience in whatever it is you're doing, and share that story with others so that they might want to come and benefit from it. So for a not-for-profit or a charity, ability, the first of these 3, means, demonstrate results, demonstrate that you are having an impact, demonstrate that, the contributions that you've received are being used wisely and astutely and for tangible benefit to the clientele. And then the second one, benevolence, which, similar word for empathy, is make sure that your organization has a culture of kindness and empathy toward all your audiences, your employees, of course, your clientele and the people you serve, your donors. I'm a philanthropist, and individually and as a company, we support many, many organizations. And I definitely come away from some of them feeling more welcome, more engaged than others. And it starts to have an influence on how much of how big is the check that you're going to write the next time. So benevolence means empathy, understanding, treating people well, understanding their needs, and being responsive. And then the last one is integrity. And I'm not telling anybody anything surprising for a charity to act with integrity, but it's just so important. Do you have a code of conduct? Does your code of conduct apply to everybody in the organization from the board on down? Is it regularly communicated and shared, and are people aware of it? Maybe do they have to sign that they support it and accept and understand it? Everything you do should ladder back up to integrity in how you operate and how you walk the talk and do what you say you're going to do, and treat people well. So those would be 3 starting points, some of which might be basic to leaders in the not-for-profit sector, but probably all could be revisited to make sure that they're really doing everything possible. And the last thing I'll say, Mary, before I don't want to go on too long here, is values are changing, and our 2023 CanTrust Index study has shown that there's the emergence of a generational gap in trust in Canada, where older Canadians, boomers and above, are showing high and rising levels of trust, whereas younger Canadians, as I mentioned earlier, Gen Z or millennials, are showing either stagnant or declining trust. And when we ask further about their values, we see differences. So, it's not a big surprise maybe that younger generations are showing us different values. And therefore, an organization needs to connect with the audience that are important to them. And if for example, you're straddling an older and a younger audience in what you do, you have to, speak to them accordingly and make sure that you are touching, what's important to each of them. It's more challenging to do that than if you're only speaking to one or the other audience. But, if you're not connecting with your audiences, you're not building trust.
Well, I'd love to go into just a bit more detail about this because it is so fascinating, because it really is talking about who your future employees will be, who your future donors will be. The actual future potential survival of a lot of nonprofits will depend on them being able to connect with young people who have different values and certainly are not feeling very trusting these days with what you're saying in terms of nonprofits or even government. Just what are you learning about them specifically that you could share for our audience that is something that nonprofit leaders really need to understand?
Right. Well, one of the biggest findings of our research this year is that the expectations of younger people toward leaders are very different than the expectations for older generations. So, for example, younger Canadians expect their leaders to be more high profile, communicative, and taking stands on important issues that go beyond just the organization's role, but social or issues around equity and inclusion, issues important to the world like climate and climate change. So if your audience or your employees are in their 20s, you've got to understand that their values are different than your own if you're an older person, and you better work at understanding them and talk and listen to them. Because if you don't, you won't connect and they won't really be very loyal and stay. There's lots of factors that go into the overall employee experience and their satisfaction. But shared values and the new expectations of young people on leaders and how leaders behave is a really big example of this. So that would be something that people in the not-for-profit sector should pay close attention to.
I would suggest that it also includes how they think about how they can continue to fundraise, and knowing that that's the future donor that they have to look forward to embracing as they continue to be effective and successful in the future. Can you just talk a little bit about the external trust in terms of that aspect of the relationship with donors and nonprofits?
Well, sure. I mean, we know that so far the evidence is that donations by younger Canadians are happening at a lower rate than older Canadians. So, how to engage younger Canadians in the philanthropy sector, in the act of giving and regularly giving is a huge challenge. So again, you've got to research and understand them and connect with them. I've worked in the not-for-profit sector as a volunteer. I've served on the board of several organizations, including the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is the largest private conservation organization charity in Canada, and connecting with younger Canadians to donate to the environmental purpose of the NCC and the conservation objectives has taken a lot of work, and it's still a work in progress. But it means, using the right platforms and talking about the issues in the right way. Young people right now are very distressed about the health of the planet and what the planet's health is going to be like for their children. And, sadly, they have a very good reason to be concerned when we see what's happened in the world. So talking about meaningful goals and meaningful actions to help mitigate climate change is a huge way for, as an example of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, to connect with younger people.
Well, Bruce, it's been just fascinating speaking with you on these critical issues at a time when public trust is needed even more than ever as the nonprofit sector emerges from the pandemic. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you, Mary. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope it helps your audience.